It was a brisk Saturday evening in early December when Eleanor Harper arrived at the grand entrance of the Langston Heritage Hall. The red carpet had already been laid out. Camera flashes flickered as local elites in tailored tuxedos and shimmering gowns filed inside for the town's most anticipated event of the year, the Langston Winter Charity Auction. Eleanor did not arrive in a black car. She did not have a designer handbag or diamond earrings. She did not wear a fur shawl draped over her shoulders like many of the women greeting each other with double-cheek kisses near the valet station. Instead, she stepped down carefully from the city bus, wrapped in a worn but neatly pressed wool coat, the same one she had worn for the last 15 winters. At 74 years old, Eleanor Harper was not someone who drew attention. Her grey hair was pulled into a simple bun, and her modest dress fell below her knees. In her hands she carried a small envelope. It was sealed and folded neatly. She held it close to her chest, as if afraid it might disappear. As she walked up the steps to the hall, she noticed two women standing near the entrance whispering to each other. One of them glanced her way and let out a short laugh. "Is she lost?" the woman asked her friend. "Probably looking for the church drive," the other replied. "This event is by invitation only." Eleanor overheard but said nothing. She had received an invitation. A white and gold envelope had arrived in the mail weeks ago, signed by the Langston Foundation itself. Still, the mocking glances and sideways stares made her hesitate. She gave her name at the front table. The young woman checking names blinked, clearly surprised. There was a pause, a moment of uncertainty. But then she found the name. "Yes, you are on the list. Table 9. Right this way, ma'am." Eleanor nodded with quiet dignity. She stepped inside the building, her eyes adjusting to the golden chandeliers and marble floors. The hall was breathtaking, but Eleanor did not marvel. She had seen these walls before, many years ago, in a very different context. She walked with purpose, unaware that before the night was over, every person in that room would know her name. Eleanor found her way to table 9, situated near the back of the hall. Most of the prime spots closer to the stage and the auctioneer's podium were already taken by familiar names in the Langston social circle. Bankers, lawyers, developers. Their laughter echoed across the room, full of self-assurance and wine. At table 9, the atmosphere was more subdued. A couple in their 40s offered polite smiles, but quickly turned back to their phones. A younger woman in a sparkling red dress looked Eleanor up and down, raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow, and said nothing. Eleanor took her seat without complaint. The envelope remained in her lap. Not long after she sat down, a flurry of activity surrounded the nearby tables. The event organizer, a tall woman in her 50s named Celeste Manning, was working the room. With a clipboard in hand and a Bluetooth headset in her ear, she walked briskly from table to table, checking arrangements, ensuring everything ran smoothly. When Celeste caught sight of Eleanor, her smile faltered. She walked over, lowering her voice. "Excuse me, are you here alone?" Eleanor looked up, her tone gentle. "Yes, my husband passed away 2 years ago. I'm here on behalf of the Harper Trust." Celeste's eyebrows twitched. "Oh, I see. Well, I'm afraid table 9 is reserved for VIP guests. There must have been a mix-up in registration." Eleanor opened her handbag and took out the invitation. She handed it to Celeste, who scanned it, her expression unreadable. It was authentic. The gold seal and signature at the bottom could not be denied. Still, Celeste hesitated. "We appreciate your support, of course, but perhaps it would be more comfortable for you to join the overflow table in the annex room. We have refreshments there as well." Eleanor looked at the people around her. None of them made eye contact. One woman was already whispering into her wineglass. "If it would make you more comfortable, I will move," Eleanor replied softly. She stood up without waiting to be asked again. Celeste offered a tight smile and turned to lead her toward the side room. The annex was far less glamorous, round tables with folding chairs. No view of the stage, no linen tablecloths. A couple of older guests chatted quietly near the cookie tray. This was where the less important guests were placed. late RSVPs, donors who gave small amounts, people who didn't belong to any club or committee. Eleanor sat at a table in the corner, still holding the envelope. None of this surprised her. She had lived long enough to know how people measured worth, by appearance, by wealth, by the stories they thought they knew. The irony, of course, was that the Langston Heritage Hall itself stood because of a quiet gift given by a man no one remembered, her husband. Howard Harper had built his fortune slowly, not with headlines or handshakes, but with persistence. He had grown up in Langston, joined the Navy, worked in shipping, then logistics, then real estate. When he passed away, few people outside the bank knew just how much he had left behind. Even fewer knew that he had made a quiet bequest to the Langston Foundation under one condition: that Eleanor would attend this event held in the building his donation had made possible. She had almost refused. She didn't want attention, she never had. But she came anyway, not for recognition, not for pride, but because Howard had asked her to. In the envelope in her lap was a letter, signed and notarized, a final message from Howard Harper. She would open it later. But for now, she waited. The auction was about to begin, and so was the lesson the room was never expecting. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as soft music played through the overhead speakers. A tall man in a tailored navy suit stepped up to the podium at the front of the room. He introduced himself as Charles Greer, the evening's auctioneer and a long-time figure in Langston's non-profit circles. Eleanor could hear his voice faintly from the annex, muffled by distance and a partially closed set of double doors. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the 37th Annual Langston Foundation Charity Auction. Tonight's proceeds will go toward preserving our town's history and expanding the scholarship fund for underprivileged students. Polite applause echoed throughout the ballroom. Eleanor clapped too, though no one in her room seemed very interested. A few were sipping tea, some checked their phones. Inside the main hall, Celeste Manning made her rounds again, smiling brightly as she leaned over to whisper to key guests, reminding them of the evening's featured items. Remember, the portrait by Harris Grant opens at $5,000, and the Langston Vineyard Tour package starts at $8,000. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded over the envelope now resting on the table. From her seat she couldn't see the stage, but she could hear the excitement rising with each item called. The bids started modestly. Framed prints, antique brooches, a week-long stay at a mountainside lodge. Laughter followed every successful bid. Applause rewarded the high bidders. When the handcrafted grandfather clock was rolled onto the stage, things began to shift. The bidding became more competitive. A tall man in a grey suit raised his paddle with confidence. A woman in pearls raised it higher. 10,000, 12, 15. People gasped and laughed as the clock sold for 22,000 to a man whose name everyone knew. Eleanor could hear the applause from where she sat. Then came the final item of the evening. Celeste approached the microphone, her voice glowing with excitement. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our most anticipated offering of the night. A one-of-a-kind original oil painting of Langston Square by noted artist Margaret Bell. This piece is appraised at over $30,000 and has never before been released for private sale. Gasps filled the room. Margaret Bell was a name that carried weight, not just in Langston, but in national circles. Eleanor sat straighter, recognizing the name. She and Howard had purchased one of Bell's first works long before anyone knew who she would become. Celeste beamed. The bidding will start at $20,000. A paddle went up almost immediately. Then another and another. 25, called the auctioneer. 30, 32. The room grew louder, each bid drawing in more attention. Champagne glasses clinked. People leaned forward in their seats. From her corner in the annex, Eleanor heard the numbers climb. 38,000. 40. Then a pause. Do I hear 42? Silence. The auctioneer turned to the crowd. Last chance. Eleanor reached into her handbag and removed a folded note. Not the letter from Howard, but something else. A pledge card. She had filled it out earlier in the day and slipped it into her purse. She stood quietly and walked toward the double doors. A volunteer at the entrance gave her a puzzled glance. "Excuse me," she said gently, "could I submit this bid?" The volunteer blinked. "The bidding is almost closed." Eleanor smiled. "Then this will be just in time." She handed the card over. The volunteer looked down, then up again, eyes wide. Eleanor turned and walked back to her table, sitting with the same quiet dignity she had carried all evening. A moment later, the auctioneer's voice returned with new energy. "We have a new bid, $45,000. A stunned silence followed. In the ballroom, heads turned. "Who?" someone whispered. Charles Greer adjusted his glasses. "The bid is anonymous," he said, "but verified. Do I hear 47? No answer. Going once, going twice, sold. Applause rippled across the room, slower this time, hesitant, curious. The painting was carried off stage. Celeste tried to maintain her smile, but something in her eyes flickered. Control was slipping. And Eleanor Harper, sitting quietly behind the curtain of the elite, had just changed the entire mood of the room with a single bid, and she was not done yet. As the applause died down, the room buzzed with whispers. "Who bid that much?" "Anonymous. It has to be someone important." "Did you see the auctioneer's face?" Eleanor sat back down at her table in the annex, calm and composed, gently folding her hands over the envelope that still lay untouched. A waiter passed by with a tray of flutes, pausing awkwardly before offering her a glass. She accepted it with a quiet nod. Back in the main ballroom, Celeste smiled tightly and returned to the stage, trying to reclaim the room's attention. "Thank you all for your generosity this evening. Your contributions will make a real difference to the Langston community. Please enjoy dessert and the rest of your evening." Polite applause followed, but the energy had shifted. People were talking more than clapping, glancing around suspiciously. Eleanor finished her champagne slowly. A few women nearby began to whisper, casting glances in her direction. "Isn't that Mrs. Harper? She's still here? I thought she left after the seating mix-up. I heard she was asked to move. Something about a mistake." One of them stood up, heels clicking against the polished floor, and walked over. "Eleanor, dear," she said, her voice syrupy, "I didn't realize you were still here. Did they fix the confusion?" Eleanor looked up at her. The woman's pearls shimmered in the light. "No confusion," Eleanor said simply. "I chose this seat." "Oh," the woman blinked. "Well, I suppose you must have had your reasons. I just assumed with how... Well, everything has changed lately after Howard passed." There it was again, the assumption that loss meant lesser, that widowhood meant invisible. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice even. "Howard passed, but not everything has changed." The woman smiled awkwardly and backed away, clearly unsure how to respond. Eleanor let her leave without another word. As dessert was served, tiny cakes with gold leaf and berries, Celeste made another loop around the room, her smile now brittle, her posture stiffer than before. She paused when she reached the annex. Eleanor looked up. Celeste's eyes narrowed. "I heard someone made quite the generous bid tonight." Eleanor sipped her tea. "How wonderful for the scholarship fund." Celeste gave a tight smile. "We do appreciate every contribution, though I admit I was surprised. Some of the guests this evening were not exactly expected bidders." "Sometimes," Eleanor said gently, "the ones who surprise you the most are the ones who built the things you now stand in." Celeste's expression froze. "What exactly do you mean?" Eleanor set her cup down and stood, smoothing the front of her dress. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, voice calm as ever. "I think the board is about to make an announcement." Celeste's eyes followed her as she walked toward the ballroom. Guests were mingling, laughing nervously, but a few took note as Eleanor entered the main space for the first time that evening. A man in a navy suit approached the microphone. It was one of the Langston Foundation trustees, Gregory Linford. His voice rang out over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude tonight's event, I have a message from the Board of Directors. We would like to acknowledge a very special person who has made an extraordinary gift to this community. Celeste turned sharply toward the stage. Eleanor stopped just inside the room, listening. Gregory continued, "As many of you know, this auction has always been held at the historic Bellman building, which has served Langston for over 100 years. He paused. A hush fell. "Well, thanks to the generosity of a long-time supporter, that building now belongs to the Langston Foundation, debt-free for perpetuity." Gasps filled the air. The whispers returned. "What? Who?" Gregory smiled. "The donation came through this afternoon. The donor asked to remain anonymous, but I think she deserves our thanks." And then, as if by some unspoken signal, the crowd turned. Every head in the ballroom slowly turned toward Eleanor, and for the first time that evening she stepped forward. The applause started with a few hands, then a few more, then the whole room. Celeste Manning stood in stunned silence, watching the widow she had dismissed become the woman everyone was now applauding. Eleanor Harper had arrived. The applause grew into a standing ovation. People who had barely noticed Eleanor earlier were now clapping, smiling, even tearing up. She stood calmly, hands folded in front of her, not basking in the spotlight, but simply receiving it as though it had always been there, waiting. Celeste stood motionless near the dessert table, her manicured hand gripping a champagne glass a little too tightly. Gregory Linford waited for the room to settle, then raised his hand again. "There's one more detail we've just been authorized to share. The donor of the Bellman building is not only a supporter of the foundation, but also one of the founding contributors to the Langston Aviation Scholarship Fund." People turned to Eleanor once more. Gregory smiled. "Tonight, she also made the single highest bid in our auction's history. With proceeds going directly to education grants, please join me in thanking Mrs. Eleanor Harper." This time Eleanor stepped up to the microphone. She did not speak right away. She simply placed her hand gently on the podium and looked across the room at faces once so eager to ignore her. "I came tonight," she began softly, "not because I wanted attention. In fact, I nearly didn't come at all." The room went silent. "I lost my husband not long ago. Howard was quiet, thoughtful, and generous in ways that most people never saw. He hated making a show of things, but he loved this community." Some of the older guests nodded solemnly, remembering the man in tailored suits who never asked for applause. "When Howard passed," she continued, "he left behind more than memories. He left behind a will that did not speak about yachts or vacation homes or stocks." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. It spoke about legacy. Gregory took a step forward, recognizing what she was holding. He nodded. "This evening," Eleanor continued, "marks the execution of a part of that legacy. Howard believed in giving without demanding recognition, but sometimes silence gives others the wrong idea." There was a pause. She scanned the room. Celeste shifted in place, eyes darting around for an escape route. "In that spirit," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "I want to clarify something else. For years, my husband quietly acquired shares in one of his favorite companies. He never made a fuss about it, but he believed in what they did. He believed in making air travel better, more humane, more dignified." Murmurs again, guests exchanged looks. "He often said people don't remember how fast they flew, only how they were treated." She paused. "The company he invested in was Lang Air." Gasps. Eleanor unfolded the will and held it up. "And with the final shares transferred upon his death, Howard Harper became the majority shareholder of Lang Air." People turned to one another in shock. The very airline whose name adorned the flyers for the gala, the airline whose CEO had shaken hands with half the room earlier that night. "And now," she said, "as the executor of his estate and trustee of those shares, that means I am." The crowd erupted into astonished conversation. Gregory stepped forward, mouth slightly open. "So you are the largest shareholder of Lang Air?" "Yes," Eleanor nodded gently, "which makes what happened to me earlier tonight interesting." Now the room was fully alert. Eleanor turned to face Celeste, who was frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. "Because tonight Before most of you arrived, I was asked to move from a first-class seat. I was told it didn't fit the image Langair wanted. I was told I didn't belong, gasps again. I was asked to move to the back. Discreetly, of course, politely, with just enough condescension to sting. Celeste's face drained of colour. And I did move, Eleanor said, not because I accepted it, but because I knew that moments like this always come back around. Howard used to say, the ones who tried to push you to the shadows usually forget who wired the lights. Laughter rippled gently across the room. So no, I didn't need the seat, but I needed the reminder. That legacy means more than power. It means knowing when to speak and when to let the truth speak for itself. She stepped away from the microphone. No dramatic bow, no lingering glance, just a simple, quiet return to her seat like a woman who had nothing left to prove. Only now, the seat she returned to was not at the edge of the room. It was surrounded by board members, scholarship recipients, and guests suddenly eager to listen. And Celeste Manning? She slipped quietly out the side door. No one followed. The rest of the evening unfolded like a soft unraveling. No more speeches were needed, no more declarations. People began approaching Eleanor in quiet groups, not with forced smiles or shallow flattery, but with genuine warmth. A woman from the scholarship committee offered her hand and called Eleanor's story the most moving thing she had witnessed in years. A young man who had won a Langston grant thanked her for her late husband's vision. Eleanor smiled, thanked them graciously, and answered every word with honesty. Even Gregory Linford, now visibly humbled, returned with a glass of water and asked if she needed anything. "You've given this foundation more than we ever knew," he said. "I hope we can honor that going forward." "You can," Eleanor said, "by making sure no one else is treated the way I was. Not here, not anywhere." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing more than just words. Across the room, the music resumed at a softer volume. Servers moved more gently. The evening had shifted from celebration to reflection. People no longer stared at Eleanor from across the room. They came to her, sat beside her, listened. Even some of those who had previously laughed behind their wine glasses now appeared unsure of themselves, awkwardly offering compliments that felt like apologies wrapped in politeness. Eleanor took it all in stride. She did not gloat. She did not make anyone feel smaller. That was never her goal. Howard had always told her, power handled with grace becomes something stronger than pride. It becomes legacy. And tonight she had finally seen that truth unfold. As the crowd began to thin, Gregory approached her again with something in his hand. "I thought you should have this," he said. It was the small printed program for the evening. On the back, someone had scribbled a note. It was Celeste's handwriting. It read simply, "I'm sorry." Eleanor folded the paper quietly and placed it in her handbag without a word. She didn't need an apology to move on, but she appreciated it all the same. Outside, the valet brought her car around. The driver opened the door for her and offered a quiet smile. "Quite a night, ma'am," he said. "Yes," she replied. "One I'll never forget." As the car pulled away from the glowing lights of the Bellman Center, Eleanor looked out the window. For the first time in months, she felt something like peace. Not because she had proven anything, but because she had protected something far greater than herself. Howard's memory and her own dignity. She thought of the early years, the cramped apartments, the second-hand suits he used to wear before their company grew, the way he never forgot where he came from. He used to tell her, "If I ever get rich, it'll be to lift people, not to look down on them." She had held on to those words through decades of board meetings, long flights and long nights. And now, with her name finally known not as a widow, but as the woman who carried his legacy with grace, she felt him beside her again. That night when she returned home, she placed the auction paddle on the mantel above the fireplace, not as a trophy, but as a quiet symbol of what had been won, and next to it she set a small photo of Howard, the one where he stood on the tarmac, smiling beside the very first Langair prototype jet. In the photo, his shirt was wrinkled and his hair tousled by the wind, but his smile was certain. She whispered toward it softly, "I kept the promise." In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to unfold. The Lang Air Board requested a meeting with Eleanor, not to challenge her, but to listen, to hear her thoughts on how the airline could return to its roots. They asked her to lead a new committee focused on passenger experience and community outreach. She accepted, but only on one condition: that no passenger is ever made to feel they do not belong, no matter what seat they are in, or what clothes they wear, or what story they carry. They agreed. Within a year, Lang Air's first-class training program was overhauled, not with luxury, but with humility. A campaign was launched featuring real passengers with powerful stories, and at the center of it all, a new tagline emerged: "Grace deserves a seat up front." The phrase swept across the industry. Passengers noticed. So did competitors. And so Eleanor Harper, once quietly removed from her rightful seat, now stood at the helm of something much bigger, not as a boardroom titan or a tycoon's widow, but as a gentle force that reminded the world what dignity looked like, not loud, not cruel, not boastful, just quietly, powerfully, unshakably right. And somewhere beyond the clouds she once watched from a cabin window, Howard Harper was smiling.